to everyone that is already in here, thanks for joining. We got more people trickling in, but we're going to kick this off and jump right into the talk. So, thanks again for coming. I'm Karam Shaban. I'm the director of the Northeast Forest Farmers Coalition, and we are gearing up for ramp season. So, we're really excited to have Steve Schwartz here with us. Going to give a presentation on ramps and talk a bit about his own operation. Steve's a ramp farmer. I'm gonna let you introduce yourself, Steve, and talk about what you do, but also a mentor in our the mentorship program that we're running through the Northeast Forest Farmers Coalition. So we're excited to have him here and to launch into this very timely topic, since maybe for those of you who have ramps or keep your eyes on them, no, they're coming up. So let me share my screen here, Steve, and get your presentation pulled up. Can you see that? Did that work?
Yes, it did.
Awesome. All right. And with that, so Steve, I'll let you, like I said, I'll let you run this how you want. If you want it to be interactive, that's great. I've got everybody, when you should probably be on mute, but if you want people to be able to just unmute themselves and jump in, however you want to run it, I'm going to keep my eyes on the Q&A. So that's also another way folks can post questions as they come to you in the chat. But with that, Steve, I'm going to pass it over to you, and we'll get rolling.
Okay, great. Thanks, Karen. So I'm Steve Schwartz. I am a generalist in my education and in my life. I am not a biologist, and I wasn't a farmer until I bought this beautiful property on the Delaware River near where it starts in the far northeast corner of Pennsylvania. And when I bought it, I wasn't planning to be a farmer. I was planning to fish on the Delaware, which I had done for 25 previous years in this area. And it was good location for fishing. It's the best stretch of the best river with wild, self-sustaining populations of brook, rainbow, and brown trout east of the Rockies. So that was what brought me to this place. And when I bought the property, I didn't have a clue what was happening here. I just knew about the location. So the property is about 20 acres on the river, and and we'll get a little bit into characterizing it, but it is mostly forested. And when I bought it, I knew nothing about the forest. I knew really nothing about managing a house. I lived in New York City in an apartment, and had a day job in high technology, and this was going to be my weekend place. And after I bought it, after I had closed in the fall, I was walking around with my next door neighbor, who was the executive director of a conservation foundation. And he said to me, Steve, you see those little black BBs over there? And I said, yeah. And he said, those are ramp seeds. And I knew what ramps were. I have friends that are chefs that had introduced me to them. This is about 18 years ago. And I looked around, and there were seed heads everywhere. And I knew that I was a lucky guy, because the property was not only in a great location for fishing, but it was full of ramps. So the next spring, when the ramps started to come up, I figured out how to harvest them and for my own use. And I asked some of my friends who own restaurants in New York City if they would trade dinner for ramps, and they said yes. So I had a couple of restaurants that I would bring ramps in to, on Monday after I was up here on the weekend, and then I would enjoy dinner there. And at the end of the season, my friend said, Steven, it's too hard for us to remember how much we owe you. Next year, we're going to just buy them. So then I started selling ramps in 2008, sorry. So let's go to the next slide, please. So a good part of the property and the places where the ramps grow the best is what's called a river flat, which are a mixed stand of deciduous hardwoods, of mature deciduous hardwoods, some of them going back 200 years or 120 years. And they're maples, they're ashes, they're birches, they're cherries, and other trees that love to grow on river flats. What I like to think of this as is about 10,000 years since the last ice age of periodic floods depositing a 16th of an inch or an eighth of an inch of sediment each time. And so on this flat, there are no rocks that, unless they were introduced by people as they inhabited the property. All of the flat is about 5 feet of sandy, loamy topsoil. And I have experienced that firsthand. I've dug down that far without finding rocks. So it's really easy to dig, but it's also great soil for growing anything, trees, ramps, and my friend Greg, who owns property like this down the river, operates the best local organic farm on about 25 acres of cultivated land. He likes to say that in now, I guess, 7 years of cultivating 25 acres, he's found 13 rocks. So it's amazing property. Again, I didn't know this when I bought it, but most of it is just sandy, loamy topsoil. The tree composition also is the type of composition that favors the growth of ramps, and most importantly, the propagation of ramps from seeds. So ramps are emerging now when the trees have yet to leaf out. Their leaves grow out to their mature state and gather in sunlight, stored in the bulbs, use that energy to produce flowers and then seeds. So by the time that the trees start to leaf out, the leaves start to senesce, to turn yellow, and soon after the flower spike comes up. So this has the right composition of the species of trees and the density of the trees to allow that to happen. Next slide, please. So on the property, you can find many of the species that like to cohabit with ramps. Here's just a few pictures. On the left, we can see the Mayapples, and on the right, Jack in the Pulpits, they're trout lilies, they're trillium, and in the center, there's skunk cabbage, which ramps don't really cohabit with, but they are really adjacent to the wet areas that the skunk cabbage is in. And then the woods is full of all kinds of invasive species. So remember, I told you that that the property, in my mind, represents 10,000 years of periodic flooding. Every time there's a flood, it brings in other species, including invasives. So there is knotweed in the dense forest that came in on a massive flood in 2006 as rhizome fragments. And you'll find 1 or 2 stalks of knotweed, unless a tree has fallen or we've taken down a tree, and then you start to get stands. There's also we did a little logging that I can talk about, and that'll bring in grasses and other things. And there's also garlic, mustard, and burdock, and multiflora rose, all of which have their own place in the woods, and all of which the ramps seem to cohabit with, but they will start to take over and block out the light that the ramps need. Next slide, please. So ramps are very exciting this time of year. They're starting to come up. They're the first green thing of spring. You know, my chefs and my friends all are interested in knowing what's going on. But for me, it's a 365-day experience. And one way to look at it is it starts in the winter. What I'm always looking for every year is succession, that the ramps have produced seeds, that the seeds have germinated. So in the middle of the winter, as I'm cross-country skiing around, I can see ramp seed heads popping up in the snow. And this is an example of that. Next slide, please. We also love and harvest and sell fiddlehead ferns, the fertile ostrich ferns. And for those of you that are interested in foraging ferns, winter is a great time to go out and look for them, because the fertile fronds are sticking up above the snow and are really unique. And it's an easy sign that you will see ostrich ferns there next spring. Next slide, please. So we love to tap our maple trees. We do it the old-fashioned way with buckets, and in a really cold, snowy winter, you know, there could be 1 foot or 2 feet of snow in the woods, and we're out there collecting sap on snowshoes. One of the fun things about doing this is that you can kind of see the history of the snow on the trees. We tend to tap the same trees, 1 tap per tree every year, and in high snow years, the holes from the previous taps are high, and in low snow years, the holes are low. So it's a little history of season snows. This year we tapped really early, maybe the 3rd or 4th week of January, because the weather was setting up good. And we got really good flows for about a month, and it was over by the end of February. So when we first tap, you don't see much in the way of ramps, but the sign for us is always that right around the trees that we tap is the place that we always see the first ramps emerging, because as you go around collecting sap, you kick off the leaf litter, and you've got bare earth, and there you can see the ramps coming up. And it wasn't this way this year. The buckets were down like a month ago, and the ramps are just starting to come up now. But there are some years where we may still be collecting sap, or at least the buckets are still up and the ramps are coming up. So I love this photo because it shows the relationship between the maples and the ramps. Next slide, please. So in the early season, pretty much right now, maybe in another week, the forest floor turns into a green carpet of ramps. They are the first green thing. They love the dappled light. They love that early season. They're very tolerant. They're very hardy. If it frosts, they're fine. A bunch of other stuff isn't, but you know, the only sign we see it on the ramps is maybe a little bit of yellow tips, but they'll be fine. And this is, you know, just a beautiful picture of the woods in the early spring. Next slide, please. And then you know, in the middle of the season, everything else starts to come up. So here's a photo of the ramps next to the Mayapples. We love the Mayapples too. The Mayapples, uh, if you've never tasted a Mayapple fruit, keep your eyes out. Where there's a big patch of Mayapples, some of them will fruit, but it's hard to get ripe ones off of the plant, and typically you have to go around and collect some green ones and put them up on the windowsill and wait for them to ripen because the animals will get them before you do. So here's a little bit about the business. We started in 2007. Over time, it grew to include restaurants, CSAs, and distributors, mostly in New York City, but also in this region. The biggest volume always went to New York City. Marketing was word of mouth. We never really did advertising, and along the way, we've learned a number of things. One is that don't harvest too early. Ramps will triple in weight over the course of the season. If you agree to sell 5 pounds now versus 5 pounds in 3 or 4 weeks, you'll spend a lot more time, or in my case, I will hire a lot more people to do the same amount of work, to do more work for the same amount of ramps, and I will lose money early in the season. But the ramp business is really a regional business all the way from the southern Appalachians up into Michigan and north of here. My customers in New York City will go to the green market and see ramps for sale. And right now, and I won't tell them, but those ramps aren't coming from here. They aren't coming from anywhere within 100 miles of New York City. They're coming from southern Appalachia. So I've resisted trying to respond to their needs and educating them on, when local ramps are ready. And I've also resisted shipping. I will get calls every year from here as far away as Seattle. One year somebody called and wanted me to fill a air freight shipping container, one of those weird things that goes in the belly of a plane, and probably with, I don't know what they would take, but 3,000 or 4,000 pounds of ramps and overnight them to Seattle. I've never done anything like that. I have tried to ship ramps a few times to friends in need, and taken all the precautions with insulated containers and ice packs, and they always end up like hung up somewhere or misdelivered or in the back of a post office, and don't look so great when they get there. So they're perfectly edible, but I like the plants to be alive and healthy and look like they just came out of the woods when I deliver them. And my largest single year in volume was 2020. All the restaurants had closed, but I had one CSA in Brooklyn who had ordered in 19, and they wanted like a quarter pound for each of their members. And I think they had 500 members in 19, and by 2020, when the pandemic hit, they had ballooned to 1,500 or 2,000 members, and they wanted the same quarter pound for each. So that was my biggest single order ever. And since the pandemic, the restaurants have come back, but by and large, they've gotten much more cost conscious. There's been a lot of transition in terms of restaurants and staffing. The deliveries to New York City have become extremely difficult. So I'm not really soliciting orders for New York City, and I'm not delivering at all unless I can arrange for the ramps to go in with one of my farmer friends to a market and then get picked up from there, or are being taken in by one of my farmer friends who has accounts and has sold ramps to those accounts. It's just turned into a pain to drive hundreds of pounds of ramps into New York City. And so I'm not doing it. But in 2022, next slide, please. We decided to try out an idea that we had before. So over the course of the years, friends have come and picked. Restaurants have sent their staff to pick, and other people have gotten to enjoy being out in the woods. So we decided in 2022 to create a new line of business we call Ramps You Pick, and it's like apples or pumpkins or blueberries. People buy tickets online for a designated time slot during the season, and they come for a few hours to learn how to select the right ramps to harvest, how to dig them, how to maintain them while they're digging, then how to process them. We teach them how to wash and weigh, and then people get some bites of ramp dishes that we make, typically pickled ramps, ramp hummus, ramp quiche, something like that. And then they go home to enjoy the ramps they've picked. And so this is the third year. We have tickets sold now for throughout the season, which will start like on the 19th of April and go through the 19th of May. We open it up 3 days a week, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, and there are 2 slots per day. There's a morning slot and an afternoon slot. And we sell no more than 10 tickets per slot. So we sell individual tickets for individual adults or groups, but bought as adult tickets. Then we sell 1 family ticket per slot, which allows families to bring a few children with them. We love to have children here, but we don't want to have too many children at a time. So during Ramps You Pick, next slide, please. The participants are asked to harvest no more than 3 pounds of ramps, and that they get maybe an hour and a half to do it. And what we found, well, let me back up. What I like to say is that if I put my mind to it, I can harvest 5 pounds in an hour, but I'm an old guy. I can only do that 45 minutes a day. When I have people here picking for the accounts, for the commercial accounts, I expect them to do 3 pounds an hour and do it for 6 or 8 hours. What we found is that most of the people that come for Ramps You Pick really only end up picking a pound and a half or so, because they're very careful. They're very careful about what they select, and we've told them how to select the mature ramps, and I think they're just really enjoying the experience. So very few people ever get to anywhere near the 3 pounds, and really I don't care if they go more than that. The other interesting thing about Ramps You Pick is that a good number of the Ramps You Pick participants are picking primarily not for culinary use, but to transplant onto their own property. And then I get reports back of I help them understand what the context is on their property and where they should plant them and how they should manage them. And then I get reports back about the success, and a lot of people have established new ramp patches from ramps they've picked on our property, and that that makes me really happy. So let's talk a little bit about managing the ramp lands. And next slide. Okay, you got it. First off, when I started, I didn't know anything about the woods and about the trees, about forest management. So one of the first things I did was I got a small grant from the Pinchot Institute to hire a forester to do a forest management plan. And as happens when you do a forest management plan, you sit down with your forester and try to establish some objectives. So he said, Stephen, what's your objectives? And I said, my primary objective is to manage the forest for the ramps. And I have observed over time where they grow and how they grow and where they grow best. And in my mind, they grow best and earliest, and we always start the harvest on the southern part of the property, which is next to a big meadow. And I believe that those ramps are getting a little bit more sun and are growing faster and earlier and larger than the ramps on the northern part of the property. So with that in mind, he said, well, Stephen, I know nothing about anything that doesn't have bark on it. And I said, I don't know much about anything that does have bark on it. So we agreed to collaborate, and we established the objectives, and then we spent 2 or 3 days surveying the entire forest very carefully. We looked at the density of light, we looked at the tree species composition, we looked at the density, we looked at a number of things, and came up with a plan with the cover pages on the left there that respected my objectives and also called for some forest management, including a selective tree harvest to try to bring more light to portions of the property that were more dense. So that was done about, I don't know, 13 or 14 years ago. And I pretty much sat on it. I didn't really want to do any logging. I was concerned about that it wasn't the right idea. But, I kept thinking about it. And finally it was the right time. And I worked with the forester to come up with a contract, which he put out for bid. And the contract said that logging could only be done when the forest floor was frozen, when the ground was frozen, had to be done in such a way as to disturb as little property as little of the soil as possible, including skid trails and staging areas and things like that. And he put it out for bid and got a few bids, and we selected one that we thought best met the objectives. And turned out the guy that won it, he was pretty much a jobber. He would do logging on behalf of a larger company, a lumber company. I think in this case it was a cabinet maker, but he was young and he was just starting out, but he invested a lot of capital in acquiring a new skidder that had tracks, so that he would not disturb the property. And he did a really great job of meeting all of the requirements. So that was done about 4 or 5 years ago. And we left all of the tops in place, and he took down some slash trees that had no value and were damaged in one way or another. And so now we've had a chance since then to see what the outcome is. And I think we definitely think that the thinning of the canopy has brought more light into areas, and that we're seeing more growth of the ramps and more growth of the understory. But like anything, when you take action, there are other consequences as well. So where we've released the forest floor for more light, we've seen more invasives, which requires more management, and we have to keep up with it. So next slide, please. So as I said, knotweed is in the forest, and is one of the things that draws my attention, so much so that a few years ago I worked with a number of partners to establish a fairly large knotweed project to do research and management and outreach to determine the extent of the knotweed, the ways that it can be managed, what is most effective, the costs, and to outreach to local landowners to get them to manage the property. And part of this was helping them establish objectives. As I said, my objective is to manage it, to try to keep it from spreading, but I'm not trying to eradicate it. I don't use chemicals. I don't have any other methodology to eradicate it, but I can control it. I think I'm not winning, but I'm also not losing. And here are a few pictures from that project. We did a number of aerial imaging flights throughout a large extent of the Upper Delaware with visible and infrared light cameras, and Shippensburg University translated that imagery into some computer learning and digital mapping to try to figure out where the knotweed was, and most importantly, in my mind, to calculate the percentage of the river plain that had been colonized by knotweed. In the upper left-hand corner picture, that is the town of Callicoon, and there's an island there that is red because this photo was taken in the fall when the knotweed had started to turn to its autumn colors. It's completely overtaken by knotweed. So the numbers out of that were something like, in the extent that we looked at, something between like 7 and 28% of the riparian corridor had been colonized by knotweed up here, which is a tremendous amount of biomass. We looked at covering, we looked at goats, we looked at using herbicides, we looked at mechanical cutting. And I can talk about that whole process at great length, but that's not the point of this presentation. So going back to managing ramp lands, next slide, please. This is really the core of my management strategy, and that is through the harvest. So as I said before, I have great woods. The ramps love it. They were here long before I was ever here, and I'm hoping they'll be here long after I'm here. We will take 200, 300, 400, 500 pounds of ramps out of about 10 to 12 acres almost every year. And after doing it for 17 years, there are more ramps than there were when I started, and they have spread their extent beyond where they were when I started. And that is because of two things primarily. In our harvesting, I and people that work for me and the participants in ramps you pick are given keys as to which plants to harvest. So unlike a wild patch that you might find somewhere where you will have dense clusters of plants coming up together, all of those are probably clones through bulb division of a mother plant. On our property, you don't find too many of those types of clusters anymore. what you find is ramps all over the place, but in any square meter of the property, you will find multiple generations. So this is an example of a patch that I photographed where you have 3-leaf plants, mature 3-leaf plants, which will send up a flower and produce seeds. But you also have 2 to 3 year plants that might have 1 or 2 leaves, and you'll have first-year seedlings. And this is what we look for. This is the key to our process. What we want is succession. We want to take mature plants that have had a chance to reproduce and leave all of the other plants to grow in and be future producers. And this is success for me. We do occasionally we'll do some transplanting or we'll do some broadcasting of seeds, but the property seems to do a pretty good job on its own of doing that. And I know that this is successful because Penn State uses this property for a number of research projects, one of which was a genetic study. And the report back that I got was that 40% of the genetically 40% of the plants they sampled were the result of seed germination, weren't clones of another plant. So they found some good genetic diversity, which is also a goal, and they found that they are reproducing by seeds. For those that aren't familiar, ramps produce both by bulb division and seed germination, but the seeds have this very hard coating on them, and it takes between 6 and 18 months for that coating to break down and then to germinate and establish a new plant. So it's a very slow process. You need exactly the right conditions for it to happen successfully. People I know have taken our ramps and planted them in sunny gardens. They will grow almost anywhere, but they will not reproduce by seed germination unless they have the right conditions. Next slide, please. So this is, we're always looking to see that we have plenty of ramp flowers coming up. And once the flowers are pollinated, they turn into, we call them ramp capers or ramp fruits. They're green. And then by September, those green fruits turn into the ramp seeds on the right. So next slide, please. So one other thing we're doing is that 2 years ago, we applied for and successfully were awarded a grant to do some research. So this is a project that I'm doing with Eric Burkhart at Penn State. The SARE program is grants to farmers to do research, and you're required to have a technical advisor as a collaborator under the project. And we had come up with this project together, Eric and I. And most of these SARE grants go for pretty much traditional farming, but every once in a while they will award one for agroforestry. So we were very excited to do that, to get it, to do the work, but also to get it to open up SARE to agroforestry. And the hypothesis is that in home use or commercial culinary use, people use the leaves of the ramp for food. They use the bulbs. They pickle the bulbs, or they broil or grill the bulbs, or put them into various preparations. And the one thing that no one ever uses is the root plate, which they discard by and large. And the question that we're looking at is, can you successfully transplant the root plate to create new plants, and that will flourish and eventually reproduce on their own. So we were awarded the grant in 22 and 23. We established plots, we processed the propagules for transplanting, and we planted them and tagged them and sorry, and let them go. This year we'll take a look and see what comes up, and then next year we will dig up some of them and weigh them and measure them and characterize the results. Next slide, please. So we established 6 plots on the property, 3 of them on land that produce robust amounts of ramps. One of them on kind of a transitional area that produces a few here and there, and then 2 of them on land that doesn't produce ramps naturally. I know that I have transplanted some ramps to that area, but there are none that grow naturally. Within each plot, we created 8 treatment sections. So we varied the size of the bulb segment that went with the roots, a 1/4 inch or a 1/2 inch. We varied the stage of the harvest. We tried it with some early, what we were calling pencil stage plants, and late teardrop stage plants. And we tried it with 2-leaf plants and 3-leaf plants. Typically, 3-leaf plants are the mature plants that will produce flowers and seeds, but we do see plenty of 2-leaf plants that are mature that are producing flowers and seeds. So we just varied that. And this doesn't show it, but we also established 2 treatments on 2 of the plots where we planted whole bulbs, which we know works well because we've done that before, just as the control. So it'll be interesting to see what the outcomes are. Our hypothesis is the larger the bulb segment and the later in the phenology you do it, the more success you'll have. But beyond that, we're interested to see whether what comes up is first-year seedlings, second-year plants, third-year, or mature plants. And we really don't know the answer to that question yet. Next slide is just, creating the propagules and setting out the plots. And, it's fun. I love hanging out with scientists, and I love doing research. And this is an opportunity for me to have my own research project. And maybe there will be a paper that comes out of it. I will be looking to Eric to do the writing, and I will love to be on one of the authors. But we don't know yet what the outcome will be. So next slide, please. And that's my contact information, and that's what my hand looks like during ramp season. So let's open it up. I'd love to find out where you all are from and what your interest in ramps is, and any questions you might have about my business or my practice or my management.
Feel free to, if you have any questions, unmute yourself, or you can post things in the chat, and I'll keep my eyes on that. One thing that I'm curious about, Steve, is thinking about folks that are maybe in a situation similar to where you found yourself when you bought the property, new to ramps, suddenly find themselves with this resource. I'm curious, since your business model has kind of evolved over time, if you have recommendations for people that are interested in getting started making a business out of their ramps, if there are things that you feel like lessons learned, maybe ways you approached it early on that you decided to change, or yeah, little tips and tricks for people interested in starting their own ramp business.
Sure. I mean, I started small and I never grew it really big. My goal every year was to have fun and to clear enough money to pay the real estate taxes. So fortunately, I had other consulting work and other sources of income. I didn't have to rely on this for subsistence. Uh, the, uh, the the I guess my advice would be start small, learn your land by being on it, but also learn it by talking to others, experts such as foresters and others, about what you have and how to approach it. If you're establishing new ramp areas, again, it's all about understanding the best habitat for it and being on it, making sure that they are reproducing and that they're producing seeds or dividing by bulbs and and being careful about it, not over harvesting it and being sustainable in your practice.
All right, I'm gonna just read from the chat here. So Bob is asking with the pick your own, do you have a farm staff person with each person or group to ensure that they're following those protocols that you talked about?
Um, no, so let me talk about the protocols that apply to um, ramps you pick. So whether we're commercially harvesting or ramps you pick, we never um, pick the same area twice. So the first week of ramp you picked, there will be a section that people are told to stay within. We'll have some stakes up showing them what that section is. Each group will have their own section within that section, and um, they, they will be given instructions and as to how and which ones to pick. Um, but then they're pretty much left alone. And part of it is I want them to enjoy the process of being in the woods and getting lost. I mean, I to this day I can be out there picking ramps and look up and not being exactly sure right away where I am in the woods. Um, so part of the my goal for this is for people to just enjoy being in the woods and having fun. And so far, no one's ever really taken advantage of it in a way that I didn't think was appropriate. But no, we don't. We set them up with the tools and the information and some kind of constraints as to where they should harvest, and then we let them go at it.
Awesome. All right. Well, next question here on our list from Jeff is, once harvested, what kind of shelf life do ramps have?
So when we harvest them, we do wash them because I've heard many stories from my chef friends about people showing up at their back door with garbage bags full of dirty ramps, and the last thing that the chefs want is to have to spend a lot of time processing them. So none of the all of the ramps that we deliver have been rinsed or washed of dirt. Um, they aren't ready to be used for culinary use. They still have to be rinsed and trimmed and all the rest. But they are clean, live plants, and they're in good shape to be planted as well as used uh, in cooking. So for the commercial orders, we deliver in 20 to 30 uh, uh, pound bins with the root plate down at the bottom and a little tiny bit of water down there to keep them fresh. Um, they will, their shelf life in a walk-in in that state is probably a week. And but the chefs know that if they're going to process them in whatever way, it's best to do that early. And you know, a lot of the processes include fermentation or drying or or making into something else, an oil or another product, some of which can be frozen. So you know, as fresh live plants that look good, about a week in a walk-in cooler or in a fridge.
All right. So Janine is asking, she planted some bulbs last fall and says they all came up. They came up with 2 leaves and is wondering how many years before she can harvest those.
First, I would wait until the flowers come up. So after the ramps senesce, the leaves die off. When they're starting to die off, turn yellow, you will see a little tiny flower spike in the middle, and then eventually that will come up and open up. I would wait and see if any of them flower, because that's really my key. Some 2-leaf plants might flower. Some 2-leaf plants won't flower until they become 3-leaf plants. So I would wait. I would wait a while. I would wait at least a year before harvesting.
All right. Well, if there are any other questions, throw them in there. Um, Jeff is describing, he's done a little experimenting planting root plates. He's saying that in his experience, partial bulbs have only produced small tops similar to 2 or 3-year-old plants. Most only have 1 leaf, but there's been a few 2-leaf plants as well, but they've been pretty small. So you're looking forward to seeing your results.
Great.
Um,
That's good to know. Thanks, Jeff.
all right. We got another one here. So when you say dormant bulbs for transplanting, what does the above ground part of the plant look like? And or like what time of year are you doing that transplanting? I've only ever transplanted while they still had leaves on for easy locating.
Right. So you can transplant live plants. That's one way to do it. But you can also wait till the fall and look for seed heads and then dig up those bulbs, which we know are mature because they've produced seeds. And we know they're dormant because they've done their work. So that is your flag, is where there's a seed head. And, you know, that's the time when they won't be disturbed in any way. They're just sitting there waiting for the spring to come.
All right. So Rich is asking, what is the difference between red stem and white stem ramps? Is one better for cultivation?
So our friends at Penn State have done a ton of research on that. They've looked at the genetics, they've looked at the phytochemicals, what are the chemicals that create red stem versus white stem. Uh, their conclusion is that some of them are the same chemicals that create red onions versus white onions. They've looked at the genetics to see if there's any genetic differences, or it's just an expression of genes differently. And they've done culinary tests where they have a blind tasting of things prepared with red stem ramps and white stem ramps. And if you want more information about that, contact Eric Burkhardt at Penn State. He has lots of information about that. For me, they're both great. They make no difference.
I would be really curious to see the results of the culinary testing. That's really interesting. All right. We got more coming in here. So Bob is asking, when you plant a new area from seed, how do you prepare the ground? Or do you start in a nursery and then transplant the bulbs in?
I don't cultivate from seed. I've never really tried it. They seem to be producing seed and germinating well on their own. I know that some companies sell seed, some people harvest seed to transplant. I would think that if the best routine would be to stratify the seed and then grow it in a greenhouse in a controlled setting, but and then transplant that. But I really don't know. If I'm out in the woods and I'm and I see a lot of seed, I might grab some and broadcast it. If I really wanted to take it seriously, I might do it like I would plant ginseng seed, which is rake up the leaf duff, plant the seeds, scratch it in, cover it up again. But I really don't know the right way to do it.
Chris is asking, what are the most important habitat characteristics for success with ramps? Any specifics known on soil pH, anything like that?
So they've tested the pH, and Penn State has tested the pH. It is, I believe it's fairly neutral. It's maybe a little bit side of acid, but it's pretty sweet land. It's pretty sweet soil for a forest. There are no oaks, or there are very few oaks. There are very few pines. Typically, ramps don't like that acidic soil that's found in those areas, and there'll be reports of ramps in those areas, but those could be areas that have had succession of species or some other change. So typically a fairly sweet soil. It has to have moisture, especially for the seed germination. So riparian areas are really good, but not wet. Where it's wet enough for the skunk cabbage, it's too wet for the ramps. So and beyond that, it's the tree composition, tree species composition, and the density.
Something that I was just down in Virginia at a forest farming conference, and Eric Burkhart was giving a talk, and he brought up soil tests. Somebody asked about, like, should I get my soil tested? And his take on it was that it is not really worth it. And he had a number of reasons. The soil tests are just testing a small area and different things. And so he reiterated that it's really about looking at the tree species composition and what you kind of just taking in the whole site holistically. So rather than being too focused, say, on an exact pH, that was his take in his talk, which made sense. And it's kind of nice. You can just use things that you can gauge right there in the woods instead of having to send something off to a lab. All right. Jeff wants to know if ramps need a more appetizing name, like forest onions. You have ever run into problems with, branding or name recognition with ramps?
Well, let me give you two answers to that. One is that, as you know, my obsession with knotweed is pretty strong, and it's edible at its early stage. So we've had a lot of talk about how to rebrand knotweed so that it's more culinary attractive. If you have any ideas that would help sell some knotweed, which I have sold, and I have sold some knotweed rhizomes to herbal supplement companies, but knotweed needs a culinary name. I don't have any problem with referring to ramps as ramps, except for where I live, where all the locals think of them as wild leeks. And Eric has a story about that, which is that basically north of Interstate 80, people refer to them as wild leeks. South of Interstate 80, they refer to them as ramps. And it could be because ramps is the derivation of the English Scottish name for a similar species that grows there that are called ransoms, rampson. And north of 80 is more Germanic, and in German parts of Europe, they refer to ramps as bear garlic or Bauerglock, or which is the derivation of leeks. So um, my New York City customers all call them ramps because I don't know, they learned about the plant from Southern Appalachia. Um,
Hmm.
but up here, I have to make sure that people know that I'm also talking about wild leeks.
Do you ever hear people refer to them as wild onions? That's sort of like I feel like I've heard that. It's at least that's like intuitive. People are like, oh, an onion that grows in the woods. I don't know. I don't know if you've heard that.
Yeah, but there are other wild onions, so uh, we try to make that distinction for people.
Yeah. All right. Well, we are basically at time and we're out of questions. So thanks. We can't really do a round of applause. Everybody's on mute, but thanks, Steve. This is great. And Steve's contact information, yeah, I know, is up there. And so feel free to reach out and yeah, hopefully we can do this again sometime. I've got recorded, so I'm going to share that with folks that weren't able to make it in person. Um, yeah, but good luck with ramp season, Steve. It's probably you got all this work coming up. Exciting
Thank you.
times.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks again, and thanks to everybody for coming. And Steve, we'll be in touch.
Thanks, Karen.
All right. See everybody.